Story 1. Lost Road. This story is about a man who, while driving late at night, takes a wrong turn and finds himself on a strange and desolate road. The further he drives, the more unsettling his surroundings become, leading him to a mysterious town that doesn't seem to belong in this world. The town's eerie inhabitants and the impossibility of finding a way out turn his journey into a nightmare he never anticipated. It was supposed to be a simple drive. I had made the trip from my hometown to the city countless times, each route so familiar that I could practically navigate it in my sleep. But that night something went wrong. The road, which should have been straightforward, seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't recognize. I had missed a turn somewhere, but instead of doubling back, I convinced myself that I could find an alternate route. The GPS on my phone was useless. It showed me drifting off into a blank space. No roads, no landmarks, just a directionless void. I drove on, the night pressing in on me from all sides. The trees along the road grew denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The headlights of my car barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. It felt as if the road was leading me somewhere, but not to the city I was trying to reach. There was something ominous in the air, a tension that I couldn't shake no matter how much I tried to reason it away. Then I saw it. In the distance of flickering light. It was faint, almost like a candle burning in the wind, but it was enough to catch my attention. I told myself that it must be a small town, a place where I could stop, ask for directions, and maybe get a cup of coffee to clear my head. As I drove closer, the light grew stronger, revealing a sign at the edge of the road. The words were barely legible, the paint chipped and faded, but I could make out the name, Middletown. I had never heard of a place called Middletown in all my years of living in the area. The name didn't ring any bells, and that alone should have made me hesitate. But I was too tired to think clearly, and the idea of finding a town in the middle of nowhere seemed like a stroke of luck. I turned onto the road that led into Middletown, feeling a strange sense of relief, though I couldn't explain why. The town was small, nestled deep within the forest, almost as if it had been hidden away from the world. The streets were eerily quiet, not a single car in sight. The buildings, old and worn, stood like silent sentinels, their windows dark and uninviting. I drove slowly, scanning for any sign of life, but there was none. It was as if the town had been abandoned long ago, yet everything was in surprisingly good condition. No broken windows, no overgrown weeds, just a pervasive stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I pulled up to what looked like a diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the gloom. Open 24 hours, it proclaimed, though the interior was dim. I parked the car and hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. Something wasn't right about this place. But I was here now, and my options were limited. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the diner, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The bell above the door chimed as I pushed it open, but the sound seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Inside, the diner was as deserted as the town. The red vinyl booths and chrome-trimmed tables looked like they had been plucked from another era, preserved in time. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, and I noticed a steaming cup sitting on the counter, as if someone had just brewed it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the stillness. No one answered. I walked to the counter, peering into the kitchen through the pass-through window, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone. The coffee pot was half full, its contents still hot, but there wasn't a single soul in sight, and there was as if the entire town had vanished, leaving behind only traces of their existence, feeling a chill run down my spine. I turned to leave, but stopped short when I saw a figure standing at the far end of the diner. I hadn't heard anyone enter, and I was certain the place had been empty just moments ago. The figure was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a man with a worn hat pulled low over his face. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way, just stood there, as if waiting. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know how I can get back to the main road?" I think I took a wrong turn. The man didn't respond immediately. When he finally lifted his head, I caught a glimpse of his eyes, cold, lifeless, as if all the warmth had been drained from them. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words that came out were barely more than a whisper. "There's no road back," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "Once you're here for a shiver of fear gripped me, and I took a step back. What do you mean?" "There has to be a way out of this town." The man's expression didn't change. "You won't find it," he said. "Middletown doesn't let go of its visitors." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a madman, but there was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made my blood run cold. I had stumbled into a place that wasn't meant to be found, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. Without another word, I turned and fled the diner, the door slamming shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the empty streets. My heart pounded as I raced back to my car, but as I reached it, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A dense fog had rolled in, enveloping the town in a thick, impenetrable mist. The road I had come in on was now hidden, swallowed by the fog, leaving me with no sense of direction. I jumped into the car and started the engine, the headlights barely cutting through the fog. I drove, desperately trying to find the road that would lead me back to safety, but the streets of Middletown twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Every corner I took seemed to lead me back to the same spot, the same desolate buildings staring back at me with their empty windows. As panic began to set in, I could feel the walls of the town closing in around me, trapping me in a maze with no exit. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I fought the rising tide of terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I had to get out. I had to find a way back. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape Middletown. The fog grew thicker, the streets more twisted, until I was no longer sure where I had come from or where I was going. It was as if the town was alive, shifting and changing to keep me trapped within its borders. Since the hours dragged on, I began to lose hope. My mind, once sharp and focused, started to fray at the edges. I could feel the town seeping into my thoughts, its dark presence wrapping around my mind like a suffocating blanket. And then, just when I thought I could bear no more, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing in the middle of the road, was the same man from the diner, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as I approached. The car's engine sputtered and died as I came to a stop in front of him, leaving me in silence once more. "You won't find your way out," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Middletown has claimed you." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The man's presence was overwhelming, his gaze piercing through me like a knife. I was trapped, lost on a road that led nowhere, in a town that shouldn't exist. And as the fog closed in around me, I realized with a growing sense of dread that I might never leave Middletown. The town had taken me just as it had taken so many before me, and there was no escape. The realization that Middletown had claimed me was like a cold hand gripping my heart, but I refused to give in to the despair that threatened to overwhelm me. The fog might be thick, and the town might be twisted, but I wasn't going to let this place consume me. I had to believe there was a way out, some path I hadn't yet discovered. I had to fight. The man from the diner still stood in the middle of the road, his eyes glowing faintly in the mist. But I couldn't let him intimidate me. I pushed the car door open and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to stand tall as I faced him. "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound strong. "Why am I here? How do I get out?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Middletown is a place for those who are lost," he said, his voice low and almost mournful. "Those who take the wrong turn, those who stray too far from the path. This town finds them, and once they're here, they can never leave." I shook my head, refusing to accept his words. That can't be true. There has to be a way out. There's always a way out. He didn't respond, just stared at me with those cold, empty eyes. It was as if he was looking right through me, seeing into my very soul. A shiver ran down my spine, but I pushed the fear aside. I couldn't let him, or this town. I'm not staying here. I said more to myself than to him. I'm going to find a way out, even if it kills me. The man's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. Many have tried, he said quietly. Few succeed, but perhaps you might. Without another word, he turned and walked into the fog, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there for a moment, uncertain of what to do next, but his words lingered in my mind. Perhaps you might be different. I had no choice but to hope that he was right. I climbed back into the car, determination hardening into resolve. I had to get out of Middletown no matter what it took. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the thick fog. I drove forward, my grip tight on the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of an... But as I drove, the town seemed to shift around me, the streets winding and looping back on themselves in impossible ways. No matter which direction I turned, I always ended up back where I started. The same buildings, the same empty streets, the same sense of hopelessness closing in on me. The hours dragged on, and exhaustion began to take its toll. My eyes grew heavy, my mind foggy with fatigue. But I couldn't stop, couldn't rest. Not when the only thing waiting for me was the suffocating embrace of Middletown. I had to keep going, had to find some way out, no matter how impossible it seemed. Just as my resolve was beginning to waver, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the distance, beyond the thick veil of fog, there was a faint glow of light. It was different from the eerie, unnatural light that permeated the town. It was warm, almost inviting. It had to be a way out. I sped toward the light, hope flaring in my chest. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, but the light grew brighter with each passing second. I was close, so close to escaping this nightmare. But as I drew nearer, I began to notice something strange. The light wasn't coming from a distant town or a passing car. It was coming from a single building at the edge of Middletown. It was a large, old-fashioned house, its windows glowing with a soft golden light. The road led straight to it, as if beckoning me inside. I slowed the car, dread gnawing at my gut. This wasn't what I had expected. The house loomed before me, its shadows stretching long across the empty street. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to turn around and leave. But I'd come this far, and there was no turning back now. I parked the car and stepped out, my feet crunching on the gravel driveway. The air was still heavy with anticipation. I approached the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The light from the windows cast eerie shadows on the ground, twisting and distorting in ways that made me feel like I was being watched. With a deep breath, I reached out and grasped the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver through my hand. The door creaked open under my hand, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. I hesitated at the threshold, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was inside, had to see if this was the way out of Middletown. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, sealing me inside. I whirled around, my heart racing, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, as if the door had never existed. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be a way out, some hidden exit I hadn't seen. The hallway stretched on before me, long and narrow, with doors on either side. I walked forward, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The light from the windows had dimmed, leaving the hallway shrouded in shadows. I reached for the first door and opened it cautiously. The room beyond was a small sitting room, furnished with old, dusty furniture. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. But there was no one inside, no sign of life. It was as if the house was waiting for something. I moved to the next door, then the next, but each room was the same, empty, untouched by time. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step I took. I could feel something watching me, something hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, I could see a faint light, different from the flickering firelight of the other rooms. It was brighter, more intense, and it beckoned me forward. I pushed the door open, revealing a large circular room. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting the light from a single glowing orb that hovered in the center of the room. The orb pulsed with an unnatural energy, casting strange, shifting patterns of light across the room. I stepped inside, the air thick with anticipation. The orb seemed to hum with power, drawing me closer. I reached out a hand, compelled by some unseen force, but just as my fingers brushed the surface of the orb, the room plunged into dark. The light from the orb vanished, leaving me in total blackness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirrors around me seemed to come to life, their surfaces rippling like water. In each reflection, I saw twisted versions of myself, distorted and nightmarish figures that stared back at me with hollow eyes. I tried to move to escape the room, but the darkness was suffocating, pressing in on all sides. The reflections in the mirrors grew more distorted, their faces contorting into grotesque expressions. I could feel the weight of their gaze, their silent judgment, and it was unbearable. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the orb reappeared, its light blindingly bright. The mirrors shattered, the sound like 1,000 screams echoing through the room. I covered my ears, but the noise was deafening, tearing through my mind. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent once more, the shattered mirrors nothing more than dust on the floor. The orb hovered in the center of the room, its light dim but still present. I didn't dare approach it again. I had seen enough, felt enough. I had to get out of this house, out of Middletown, before it was too late. I turned and fled the room, racing down the hallway. The walls seemed to close in around me, the house shifting and warping as I ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that room, away from the orb and the terrible power it held. But no matter how fast I ran, the house seemed to stretch on forever. The exit always just out of reach. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating me. My lungs burned, my legs ached. I had to keep running, had to find a way out. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, bathed in light. It was different from the other doors, larger, more ornate, as if it was meant to be the way out. I pushed myself harder. Every ounce of strength I had left focused on reaching that door. I burst through the door and stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, clearing my mind. I was outside, standing on the porch of the house, but something was different. The fog was gone, the oppressive weight lifted. The night sky was clear, stars twinkling above. I turned back to look at the house, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. There was no sign of the house, no sign of Middletown, just a lonely road stretching out into the darkness. I didn't waste any time. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. The road was empty, the night silent, but I could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. I didn't know how long I drove or where I was going, but eventually I saw the lights of a town in the distance. It wasn't Middletown. This place was alive, real. I pulled into a gas station, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from the experience. I got out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and walked inside. The clerk behind the counter looked up as I approached, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Long night?" he asked, his tone casual. I nodded, too shaken to speak. I paid for my gas and left without another word, my mind still trying to process what had happened. As I drove away from the gas station, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the fog creeping up behind me, the ghostly lights of Middletown on the horizon. But there was nothing, just the open road and the night sky above. I knew I had escaped Middletown, but I also knew that the memory of that night would haunt me forever. The road had taken me somewhere I was never meant to go, shown me things I was never meant to see, and though I had managed to find my way back, a part of me would always be lost on that forgotten road. wandering through the twisted streets of Middletown, searching for a way out that might never come. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, to convince myself that it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. Middletown was real, and so were the things I'd seen there. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I can still hear the faint hum of the orb, feel the cold grip of the fog, and see the twisted reflections staring back at me from the shadows. Middletown is still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to take a wrong turn, to stray too far from the path, and I pray that it never finds me again. In Story 2, The Highway No, 13, at the road to nowhere, I'm about to share with you a story that's been haunting my thoughts ever since that fateful night. It's a tale of Highway No, 13, a stretch of road that disappears into the darkness like a sinister chasm, and a mystery that has puzzled locals for decades. They say it's a place where reality bends and sanity teeters on the edge of madness. On a stormy evening, when the rain lashes out and the wind howls like a banshee, vehicles vanish without a trace. The most chilling rumor is about a whole bus of passengers that vanished one night, swallowed whole by the black abyss of this cursed road. If you're brave enough to listen, I'll recount what happened to me as I ventured down Highway No. 13 uncovered the eerie truth behind its reputation. I had always been drawn to the macabre and the unexplained, so when I heard the rumors about Highway No. 13, my curiosity was piqued. The road had a reputation for being more than just a treacherous route. It was said to be a portal to something otherworldly. The locals spoke of it with a mix of dread and fascination, their eyes wide with fear when they described the mysterious disappearances that occurred under the cloak of darkness. The night I decided to test the stories was particularly stormy. It was late autumn, and the wind roared like a wild beast. The rain came down in relentless sheets, creating a curtain of water that blurred the world outside my windshield. My car's headlights cut through the darkness like a knife, but the oppressive blackness seemed to push back against the feeble illumination as I turned onto Highway No. 13, a chill ran down my spine. The road stretched out before me, seemingly endless and foreboding. The trees that lined the road were twisted and gnarled, their skeletal branches reaching out like accusing fingers. I could barely see beyond the edges of the road. The shadows seemed to swallow everything in their path. I drove cautiously, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The radio crackled with static, the familiar tunes of the evening news replaced by eerie white noise. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional gust of wind that made the car shudder. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something peculiar. The road seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied logic. I passed the same old dilapidated barn 3 times, though it seemed to be in a different position each time I saw it. The sensation of déjà vu was overwhelming, as if I were trapped in a loop. The first real sign that something was wrong came when I saw a car parked on the side of the road. It was an old, rusted sedan, its windows fogged up and its engine silent. The car looked abandoned, but as I slowed down to investigate, I noticed something even stranger. The interior lights were flickering on and off as if someone were trying to get my attention. My instincts told me to keep moving, so I drove past, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The storm grew fiercer, and visibility dropped to near zero. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but it was as if the darkness was reaching out to engulf me. The wind howled louder, and I could hear something else now. A low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the very depths of the storm. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize the sound, but it was unlike anything I had ever heard. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching in protest. The figure was a woman, drenched from the rain and wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could see that she was holding something, a small, tattered piece of paper. I rolled down the window, the sound of the rain growing louder. "Are you all right?" I shouted over the noise. The woman didn't move or respond. Her head was bowed, and her hair hung in wet strands over her face. Fear gripped me as I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but when I looked up, the woman was gone. There was no sign of her on the road or in the surrounding darkness. I looked around frantically, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The only thing I saw was the relentless rain and the black void of the forest. I continued driving, my mind racing with questions. Who was that woman? What was she doing out here in the middle of a storm? And why did she disappear so suddenly? As the minutes ticked by, I noticed something even more disturbing. The road seemed to shift and change as I drove. The landmarks I'd passed earlier now unrecognizable. It was as if the highway itself was alive, morphing and twisting in ways that defied logic. The feeling of being trapped intensified. My car's engine sputtered and stalled, and I was left sitting in the darkness with only the sound of the storm for company. I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic set in as I realized I was stuck on Highway No. 13 with no way to call for help. I decided to get out of the car and investigate. The rain poured down in torrents, soaking me through as I stumbled into the night. The wind whipped around me, making it almost impossible to see. I stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find some sign of civilization or at least a phone signal. As I walked, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A rusted sign partially buried in the mud. It was barely legible, but I could make out the words. Abandon all hope. Yehu enter here, the old saying, once a warning for the damned, now seemed all too real. With each step, the darkness seemed to close in tighter, and the storm grew more intense. The rain pounded against my face, and the wind howled like a banshee, carrying with it the faint, eerie echoes of the mournful wail I had heard earlier. I could feel something watching me, something malevolent and unseen. Every now and then, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The sense of dread was palpable, and I felt as if I was being led deeper into the heart of the storm, where no one could hear my cries for help. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A pair of headlights piercing through the darkness, coming towards me. Relief washed over me as I waved my arms, hoping the driver would see me and stop. The vehicle approached slowly, its headlights cutting through the rain like a beacon. As it got closer, I could make out the shape of an old bus, the kind that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The bus pulled up beside me, and the door creaked open with a groan. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, hoping for shelter from the side. The bus was eerily silent. The seats were old and covered in dust, and the air was heavy with the musty smell of decay. The only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I moved cautiously down the aisle, looking for anyone who might be inside. The bus appeared to be empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I made my way to the front of the bus. At the driver's seat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A photograph pinned to the dashboard. It was a faded picture of a group of people, their faces frozen in smiles. But what was chilling was the date written on the bottom of the photograph. The same date as tonight. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard a sound from the back of the bus. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the darkness. My heart raced as I turned to face the sound, but before I could react, the bus doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. The bus began to move, lurching forward with an unsettling jerk. I stumbled and grabbed onto the nearest seat for support, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The bus drove through the storm, the rain pounding against the windows like a relentless drumbeat. Outside, the darkness seemed to close in even tighter. The road was nothing more than a void, and the sense of being lost was overwhelming. I tried to calm my racing heart, but the fear was too intense. The bus continued down Highway No. 13, its headlights cutting through the gloom, but there was no sign of escape. I knew that the longer I stayed on this cursed road, the more I risked disappearing into the darkness, just like the countless others who had vanished before me. The mystery of Highway No. 13 was becoming all too real, and I was trapped in its nightmarish grip. The bus lurched forward, its movements uneven and erratic. I gripped the back of a seat, trying to steady myself as the vehicle plunged deeper into the storm. The rain battered the windows with relentless force, distorting the view outside into a swirling mess of shadows and light. The growling sound from the back of the bus grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow. I had no idea where the bus was headed or how to stop it. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The flickering light above seemed to dim and brighten at random intervals, casting eerie, elongated shadows on the walls. As I reached the rear of the bus, the growling intensified. The noise seemed to come from a storage compartment, one of those small overhead bins. My heart pounded in my chest, and I hesitated for a moment before I forced myself to open it. Inside, I found a collection of strange objects. Old newspapers, tattered clothing, and a stack of weathered photographs. One photo caught my eye. It showed a group of people standing in front of a bus, similar to the one I was in. Their faces were familiar, as if I had seen them somewhere before. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized they were all smiling, but their eyes held a haunting emptiness. I was about to turn away when I noticed something else. A small, worn diary wedged between the photographs. I opened it with trembling hands, and the entries inside were dated from years ago. Handwriting was frantic and erratic, describing how the writer had been trapped on the bus, unable to escape the road that seemed to stretch on forever. The final entry was scrawled in a shaky hand. "We are lost. The road keeps changing. There is no escape. They're coming." As I read the diary, the growling sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low, moaning wail. I could feel a presence behind me, something malevolent and unseen. I closed the diary and tried to push the storage compartment shut, but it wouldn't. The growling was right behind me now, the suffocating, inhuman sound. Panic surged through me, and I ran back to the front of the bus. The driver's seat was empty, and the bus continued to move through the storm without any visible guidance. I tried to find a way to stop the bus, but all the controls were unresponsive, as if they were dead. The darkness outside the windows was impenetrable. It was as if the storm had become a living entity, closing in on us from all sides. The road seemed to disappear into an endless void, with no landmarks or signs to indicate our progress. Suddenly, the bus jolted violently, throwing me to the floor. I heard a loud crash and felt a terrifying sense of weightlessness. When I looked up, I saw that we had left the road and were now driving through a dense, foreboding forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The bus skidded to a stop, and the lights flickered out. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in pitch darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. I got up and stumbled towards the front of the bus, trying to make out anything in the darkness. The growling was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could hear faint whispers and the occasional thump, as if something was moving around outside the bus. I reached the front and tried to look through the windshield. The forest outside was a dense, black wall. There was no sign of the road or any indication of where we were. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon, which barely pierced through the canopy of trees. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I turned around and saw that the bus was now completely empty. The seats were abandoned, and the once thick layer of dust had been disturbed, as if someone or something had been moving around. I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, and the whispers seemed to be coming from all directions. I knew I had to get out of the bus. I forced the doors open and stepped out into the forest. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the ground was still wet and slippery. I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find any sign of the road or a way out of the forest. The forest was eerily silent now, the only sound being the occasional drip of water from the trees. I walked for what felt like hours, my exhaustion growing with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the darkness felt oppressive. Then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A faint light in the distance, like a distant beacon. I made my way towards it, hoping it was a sign of civilization. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I could make out the shape of an old, decrepit house. It looked abandoned, but it was my only hope. I approached the house cautiously, the rain now reduced to a light drizzle. The house was surrounded by overgrown vegetation, and the windows were boarded up. I pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was as old and decrepit as the exterior. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I moved through the house, searching for any sign of life or a way to call for help. The only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant rumble of the storm. As I explored, I came across a room with a large mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror was cracked and covered in grime, but I could still make out my reflection. I looked different. My eyes were wild and haunted, and my face was covered in grime and sweat. I could see something else in the mirror, though. A shadowy figure standing behind me, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, and the only sound was the soft patter of rain against the window. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized I was not alone, and I continued to search the house, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could help me. The house seemed to be a trap, a place designed to keep me in the darkness forever. I felt a growing sense of despair as I realized that I might never escape. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to subside. The rain slowed to a light drizzle, and the wind died down. I sat in a dusty old chair, trying to gather my thoughts. The house was silent, but the sense of being watched never left me. Just as dawn began to break, I heard a faint sound. A distant, rhythmic thumping. It grew louder and closer, and I could make out the shape of a figure approaching the house. I moved to the window and looked outside. To my astonishment, I saw a group of people, rescue workers and locals, walking towards the house. They were carrying flashlights and calling out to me. I rushed outside, my heart filled with relief, as they reached me and led me away from the house. As I left the forest behind, I looked back at the old house one last time. It stood there, dark and silent, a grim reminder of the horrors that lurked within. The rescue workers assured me that I was safe, but I knew that Highway No. 13 and the haunted house would forever remain etched in my memory. The mystery of Highway No. 13 remains unsolved, a dark legend that continues to haunt the minds of those who dare to venture down its cursed path. The road, it seems, holds its secrets tightly, and those who seek to uncover them may find themselves lost forever, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself on a stormy night with the wind howling and the rain lashing against your windows, remember the story of Highway No. 13. For some roads are best left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 3. The Last Route. In the quiet town of Ravenswood, where tales of the supernatural are as old as the town itself, one story stands out among the rest. It's a story that has been whispered in hushed tones by locals, a tale so chilling that it's often avoided altogether. The story is about a bus driver who, on a seemingly ordinary night, picked up a group of passengers who had vanished without a trace years before. Their bodies were never found, but the icy chill that filled the bus and the strange symbols left behind were enough to make even the bravest soul shiver. This is that story, one that delves into the eerie and unexplained, a night that would change the driver's life forever and add another layer of mystery to the old bridge that spans the dark river. It was a dreary evening when I took over the night shift at the Ravenswood bus depot. The skies were cloaked in an ominous shade of gray, the kind of gray that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy shroud. So the dispatcher, an elderly man with a tired face, handed me the keys to bus 47, a rusted old thing that had seen better days. I was used to the creaks and groans of the bus. It was part of its character. As I started the engine, I could feel the vibrations through the steering wheel, a reminder of the countless miles the bus had traveled. Tonight's route was particularly routine. Just a few stops around town before heading out to the outskirts, where the old bridge lay. The bridge had a reputation of its own, rumored to be cursed. But being a practical man, I brushed off such tales as mere superstition. The bridge, though, was an unavoidable part of my route. a necessary path that connected Ravenswood to the more isolated areas beyond. The first few stops were uneventful. The usual mix of tired faces and sleepy passengers boarded the bus, each lost in their own world. But as we approached the outskirts of town, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder, an unexpected chill that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the bus. I shrugged it off, thinking perhaps it was just the night's chill making its presence known. When we reached the old bridge, the bus was nearly empty. Just a few passengers remained, including an elderly woman who sat quietly at the back and a young couple who appeared to be lost in their own conversation. The bridge itself loomed ahead, its structure partially obscured by the dense fog that had settled in. As we started across the bridge, I noticed something unusual. The temperature in the bus dropped significantly, and I could see my breath fogging up the air. The few remaining passengers seemed oblivious to the cold, but I could feel it growing more intense by the minute. The lights of the bus flickered as if struggling against an unseen force, and a sense of unease settled over me. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chill stopped. The bus seemed to warm up again, though the air still held a faint chill that I couldn't quite shake. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The seats in the back were now marked with strange symbols, carvings that hadn't been there before. They were crude and uneven, almost as if they had been scratched into the fabric by an impatient hand. As we crossed the bridge and continued down the dark, winding road, I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the symbols on the seats troubled me, and I couldn't get the image out of my mind. I made a mental note to inspect the bus further when I reached the depot. The bus reached the final stop, and the few passengers disembarked. The elderly woman gave me a nod as she left, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. The young couple, too, exited the bus, their conversation hushed as they walked away. I was left alone on the bus, with my growing unease. Returning to the depot, I performed a thorough inspection of the bus. The symbols were still there, etched into the seats, and the chill remained in the air. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just a prank or some residue from an old, forgotten journey. But the unsettling feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The dispatcher noticed my discomfort when I returned. He gave me a curious look as I mentioned the strange symbols and the unexpected cold. His expression changed from curiosity to something darker. He leaned in a low voice said, "You're not the first to see them, you know. There's an old story about a group of passengers who vanished on that route years ago. They were never found, but their bus was found empty, save for a cold that couldn't be explained and strange markings that no one could decipher." His words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. I tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. The thought of those missing passengers, their fates intertwined with the symbols and the cold, haunted me. I knew I'd have to face the bridge again soon, and the thought of what I might encounter left me with a growing sense of dread. At night, as I lay in bed, the symbols kept appearing in my dreams. They twisted and turned in my mind, taking on a life of their own. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting for me on that bridge, something that had been waiting for a long time. And so, with each passing day, the story of the last route grew more disturbing. The bridge, with its old, creaking planks and its cold embrace, seemed to hold a secret that was slowly coming to light. The next journey across that bridge would be one I'd never forget. The whispers of the past and the eerie chill that accompanied them were only the beginning of a story that was far from over. The days leading up to my next shift were plagued with restless nights and unsettling dreams. The symbols on the bus seats and the icy chill that had filled the vehicle remained etched in my memory, a constant reminder of the eerie events from my last journey. When the day of my next shift arrived, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but duty called, and I had no choice but to face what lay ahead. The sun had barely set when I reported for duty, the skies already dark and foreboding. The dispatcher, a wiry man with deep lines etched into his face, handed me the keys to bus 47 with a knowing look. He seemed to sense my apprehension but said nothing, leaving me to my own thoughts. I took a deep breath and steered the bus out of the depot, the engine's rumble a small comfort against the growing unease in my chest. As I began the route, the familiar stops and passengers provided a sense of normalcy, but the foreboding atmosphere quickly returned as we neared the outskirts of town. The temperature dropped noticeably in the air, and the bus became thick with a chilling presence. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road, but the haunting memories of the previous trip loomed large in my mind. When we reached the old bridge, the fog was even thicker than before, obscuring the view ahead. I could barely see the road, the bridge's dark silhouette barely distinguishable against the dense mist. I slowed the bus to a crawl, my senses on high alert. The symbols had not left my mind, and the thought of encountering them again made my heart race. As we crossed the bridge, the familiar drop in temperature occurred. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. The symbols were back, etched into the seats once more, glowing faintly in the dim light of the bus. The cold was more intense than before. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The bus lights flickered erratically, and an inexplicable sense of dread filled the air. The bus was now unusually quiet. The few passengers, a mix of familiar faces and new ones, seemed unaffected by the cold and the strange atmosphere. Their silence was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I forced myself to concentrate on the road, though the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. As we reached the midpoint of the bridge, an unexpected jolt shook the bus. I slammed on the brakes, and the vehicle came to a screeching halt. The lights dimmed and flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the interior. I tried to restart the engine, but it sputtered and died, leaving us in near total darkness. The bus was now eerily silent except for the sound of the fog swirling outside. I could see the faint, ghostly outlines of the symbols on the seats, their shapes shifting and writhing as if alive. The air was filled with a cold, dense fog that seeped through every crack and crevice. I could barely make out the faces of the passengers in the dim light of the emergency flashlight. I managed to turn on. One of the passengers, an older man sitting near the back, stood up and approached me. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and distant. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who was no longer part of this world. His voice, when he spoke, was a mere whisper, barely audible over the sound of the fog. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice trembling. "The bridge takes those who are lost, those who are meant to join the others." I tried to ask him what he meant, but he simply turned away and walked towards the back of the bus, disappearing into the mist. The other passengers remained still, their eyes glazed over as if they were in a trance. I felt a growing panic as I realized that we were stuck, trapped between the known and the unknown. I reached for the radio, trying to contact the dispatcher or anyone who could help us. But the radio crackled with static, and no response came through. My attempts to restart the engine were futile, the bus remaining silent and unresponsive. Suddenly, a low, mournful wail echoed through the fog, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a cry filled with sorrow and despair, and it chilled me to the bone. The fog seemed to close in around us, its cold tendrils wrapping around the bus and making it feel even more isolated. The symbols on the seats began to glow brighter, their shapes becoming more distinct. They seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were alive and trying to communicate something. I felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand what was happening and how to escape. The old man who had spoken earlier reappeared, his face now illuminated by the eerie glow of the symbols. He approached me again, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness. "The bridge takes those who are lost," he repeated. "You've crossed over, and now you must find your way back before it's too late." His words were cryptic, but they carried an undeniable weight. I looked around at the passengers, their faces now showing signs of fear and confusion. It was clear that we were all caught in something beyond our comprehension, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. In a desperate bid to escape, I forced myself to focus on the bus and the bridge. I needed to find a way to get us out of this nightmare. I tried once more to start the engine, and to my surprise, it roared to life. The lights flickered back on, and the bus began to move, though the fog remained thick and oppressive. We crossed the bridge and entered the clearer part of the road. the fog slowly dissipating as we drove. The passengers were silent, their faces a mix of relief and lingering fear. As we approached the depot, I glanced back at the bridge, its dark silhouette fading into the distance. A sense of dread that had filled the bus began to lift, but the memory of what we had experienced lingered like a shadow. When I returned to the depot, I was met by the dispatcher, who looked at me with a knowing expression. He said nothing about the night's events, but handed me a new set of keys, as if to say that the old ones were no longer needed. I knew better than to ask questions. Some things were better left unexplained. The story of the last route had become part of the depot's lore, a tale that would be passed down through the generations. It was a story of a bus, a bridge, and a chilling encounter that defied explanation. And as I left that night, I knew that the bridge would remain a part of me, its secrets intertwined with my own. The last route had shown me that there are places where the boundaries between worlds blur, and some journeys once taken are never truly over. Story 4. Hidden Path. It started with an ordinary hike, one of those lazy weekend escapes from the city that seemed to promise nothing more than the usual tranquility of nature. But this time, we stumbled upon something that defied explanation. A hidden path that led us to an abandoned village shrouded in mystery and darkness. What we encountered there was not merely unsettling but terrifying, as we began to see faceless figures whispering our names in the dead of night. This is the story of how an innocent adventure turned into a nightmarish ordeal. The sun was high in the skies, my friends, and I set out on what was meant to be a straightforward hike through the dense forest near our town. We had chosen this trail on a whim, charmed by its reputation for scenic beauty and peace. Little did we know that this seemingly benign route would soon unveil a secret that no one had prepared us for. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the sounds of the bustling world faded away, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. The trail was narrow and winding, but it was well trodden and clear, leading us through a canopy of green that seemed to shield us from the outside world. We joked and laughed, savoring the rare chance to escape our daily routines. Hours passed, and we reached what appeared to be a clearing. It was different from anything we had seen before. A serene meadow bordered by towering oak trees, their branches forming a protective arch. In the center of the clearing, partially hidden by undergrowth, was a narrow path that seemed to beckon us. Its presence was unusual, almost as if it had been deliberately concealed by nature itself. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to follow it, thinking it might lead us to a scenic overlook or a hidden waterfall. The path quickly became less distinct, almost as if it were fighting to remain hidden. The underbrush grew thicker, and the air seemed to grow cooler. Shadows from the dense foliage created an eerie atmosphere, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Despite our unease, we pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and a sense of adventure. After what felt like hours of trudging through increasingly tangled vegetation, we emerged into what looked like the remnants of an old village. It was clear that the place had been abandoned for a long time. Crumbling cottages with collapsed roofs stood in disrepair, their once vibrant colors faded to muted hues by the passage of time. The streets were overgrown with weeds and vines, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. We cautiously explored the village, each step echoing eerily in the silence. The houses, though seemingly deserted, gave off an unsettling feeling, as if they were holding on to the memories of those who had once lived there. Inside one of the cottages, we found remnants of old furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, and broken glass littered the floor. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, abandoning their belongings without a second thought. As dusk began to fall, we decided it was time to head back. But the path we had come from was no longer visible. The once clear trail had become a maze of twisting roots and dense thickets. Panic started to set in as we realized we were lost. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over us. We tried to retrace our steps, but every direction seemed to lead us back to the village. It was as if the forest itself had conspired to keep us there. Just when we were about to lose hope, we noticed something strange. Faint, ghostly figures appeared among the trees, their shapes shifting and blending with the shadows. They had no faces, just indistinct forms that seemed to drift silently. It was difficult to determine if they were real or just figments of our frayed nerves. One of my friends, Sarah, claimed to have heard someone whisper her name. We all brushed it off as an echo or a trick of the wind, but the whispering persisted. It was unnervingly close, like someone was right behind us, calling our names in soft, mournful tones. We could hear the whispers more clearly now, each one distinct but overlapping, creating a chorus of unsettling murmurs. We stumbled upon a dilapidated well in the center of the village square. The sight of it filled us with an inexplicable dread. The well was covered with an old wooden lid that seemed to creak in protest whenever we approached it. Despite our fear, we were drawn to it, unable to look away. As we gathered around it, the whispers grew louder, and the faceless figures seemed to close in on us, their presence more palpable than ever. Desperation drove us to investigate the well. With trembling hands, we lifted the lid, revealing a dark abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly. The stench of rotting wood and stagnant water wafted up, mingling with the cold, eerie silence. We shone our flashlights into the depths, but the darkness was impenetrable. Just as we were about to close the lid, something from within the well reached up. A cold, skeletal hand that grabbed at the air, as if trying to pull itself. We screamed and fell back, scrambling away from the well. The figures around us seemed to become more agitated, their whispers growing into a cacophony of voices. Panic took hold and we ran, weaving through the maze of abandoned houses, trying to find our way back to the path. The forest seemed to conspire against us, its twists and turns leading us further into confusion. The night was unforgiving, and the forest seemed endless. We finally stumbled upon a small cabin that appeared less dilapidated than the others. It seemed to offer a temporary refuge from the oppressive darkness outside. We entered the cabin and barricaded the door, hoping to find some rest before attempting to find our way outside. The cabin was surprisingly well preserved. Old, dusty furniture was arranged in a manner that suggested someone might have lived there not too long ago. We found an old journal on a table, its pages yellowed and brittle. Flipping through it, we discovered entries that spoke of the village's eerie history. Tales of faceless figures and whispers from the dark. The last entry was scrawled in a frantic hand, warning of a curse upon the village and urging anyone who found themselves there to leave before it was too late. We spent the rest of the night in uneasy silence, each of us lost in our thoughts and fears. The whispers outside continued, a haunting reminder of the village's dark past. Sleep was elusive, and when dawn finally broke, we ventured out of the cabin, determined to leave the village behind. The forest seemed to have a different character in the daylight, but the hidden path was still elusive. We eventually found our way back to familiar terrain, exhausted and shaken by the night's events. The village remained behind us, a place that seemed to resist our attempts to understand it. As we left the forest, we couldn't shake the feeling that the village had changed us in some inexplicable way. The faceless figures and the whispered names remained with us, a lingering reminder of the hidden path and the secrets it held. We vowed never to return, but the memory of that night would haunt us forever. This is only the beginning of what happened in the hidden village, and the true extent of the horror we faced is far from over. We were determined to put the horrors of the village behind us, but the experiences of that night left a lingering scar on our psyches. The trek back to civilization was fraught with a palpable sense of dread, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let us leave. Yet, we finally emerged from the trees, relieved to see the familiar sights of our town. But the sense of relief was short-lived. The events of the previous night continued to haunt us. That evening, as I lay in bed trying to forget the nightmarish visions, a strange occurrence jolted me awake. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was faint and distorted, but it seemed to whisper my name. Startled, I hung up and dismissed it as a prank or a wrong number. But when it happened again the next night, I couldn't ignore the chilling coincidence. Over the next few days, each of us experienced unsettling phenomena. Sarah's house seemed to harbor an unnatural chill, and every night she would hear the whispers that echoed through the village. Mark, on the other hand, reported seeing fleeting shadows in his peripheral vision, figures without faces that seemed to move in the corners of his eyes. We all felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, as if the village had reached out to us from its hidden realm. Despite our attempts to ignore these incidents, they only intensified. One evening, while reviewing the journal we had found in the cabin, I noticed that the entries were not as random as we had first believed. There was a recurring mention of a curse of remembrance, and how the village preyed on those who ventured too close. The author of the journal had recorded sightings of faceless figures and whispers that grew louder with each passing day. The entries had become increasingly frantic, with the last pages detailing a desperate attempt to escape the village's malevolent grasp. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew more intrusive. It felt like an invisible force was seeping into our daily lives. The faces of strangers seemed to shift in and out of focus, becoming faceless specters like those we had seen in the village. I started to notice strange occurrences around my home. Doors creaking open on their own, objects moving without explanation, and an inexplicable coldness that settled in every room. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to take a walk through the town. The night was still and quiet, but the familiar streets seemed altered, as though they were part of an elaborate illusion. As I wandered, I found myself drawn to the old town library, a place that had always been a sanctuary for me. The library was closed, but I noticed a faint light flickering from within. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the library was eerily silent. The flickering light came from a lamp on a desk where an old, dusty book lay open. I approached it, and to my horror, I realized it was another journal, similar to the one we had found in the village. This one was filled with even more disturbing entries. The last page was a desperate plea for help, written in a hand that had clearly been shaking with fear. The entry described a ritual that was believed to be the only way to break the village's curse. A ritual that required a sacrifice to appease the malevolent entities that haunted the village. The author wrote that they had tried to perform the ritual, but had been thwarted by the very entities they sought to appease. The final line was a chilling warning. Do not return. The village seeks more than your presence. It craves your very soul. I left the library in a state of panic, realizing that the village's influence was more profound than we had ever imagined. The following day, we all met to discuss our experiences. Each of us had been plagued by the same disturbing phenomena: faces without features, whispers in the dark, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. In a desperate attempt to rid ourselves of the village's grip, we sought the help of a local historian who specialized in folklore and ancient curses. After hearing our account, the historian was visibly shaken. He revealed that the village had a dark history, rooted in old legends of a community that had been cursed for their sins. According to the lore, the village had once been a haven for those seeking refuge from persecution, but it was discovered that they practiced forbidden rites. So the curse had been placed upon the village to ensure that no one would ever leave, and that those who ventured near would be subjected to its malevolent influence. Determined to break the curse, we decided to perform the ritual described in the journal. We gathered the necessary items, a symbol of sacrifice and items from the village, as detailed in the journal, and prepared ourselves for what we hoped would be the final confrontation with the village's dark forces. As night fell, we gathered in a clearing near the edge of the forest, where the village's malevolent presence still seemed to linger. The ritual began with a series of incantations and offerings, but the atmosphere was charged with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, louder and more urgent, as if the village itself was reacting to our intrusion. The figures appeared once more, their faceless forms emerging from the darkness. The ritual was supposed to be a way to appease the entities, but instead it seemed to provoke them further. The faceless figures moved closer, their whispers coalescing into a haunting chorus that filled the night with an unbearable sense of dread. As we completed the ritual, a sudden silence fell over the clearing. The figures disappeared, and the whispers ceased. We were left with an eerie calm, but the sense of relief was overshadowed by the realization that we might not have succeeded in breaking the village's influence had left its mark on us, and no amount of ritual or attempt to confront it could erase the lingering presence we felt. We left the forest behind, but the village's memory remained with us. The faceless figures, the whispers, and the chilling experiences would forever be a part of our lives. We had ventured into the hidden path and encountered a darkness that defied explanation. Our lives had been forever altered by the cursed village, and the haunting reminder of that night would never truly fade. The hidden path was never found again. The village remained shrouded in darkness, its secrets forever sealed within the forest, and though we escaped its grasp, we could never forget the terror that awaited those who dared to follow the path into its depths. The forest had claimed its toll, leaving us with more questions than answers and a profound sense of unease that would linger for the rest of our lives. The hidden path had revealed a darkness beyond comprehension, and its curse would remain a shadow over our lives, a chilling reminder of the horrors we had faced and the malevolent force that still lurked in the forgotten village.